Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 6th of January 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're also joined by David Scott, bringing us northern exposure from north of the border in Scotland, of course. I find it hard to do the 2020 bit, Mike. That used to be one of the common purpose famous courses we will remember, but it only seems a year ago that we were worried about the year 2000 and the collapse of Western civilization due to computer problems.
Well, absolutely, but are we looking at collapse of Western civilization again as a result of computer problems within the head of Donald Trump?
Well, quite possibly, but of course the BBC delighted over the Christmas period to have some death to report.
Absolutely. Well, that's absolutely true, and we'll come on to that in a second. Of course, this is how Trump was presenting the whole situation of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, assassinated by a US drone strike on Friday. Everybody, I'm sure, knows about that by now, but Trump called this man the #1 terrorist in the world, and so that's why they did it, apparently. So he was, of course, by many recognized as, or considered, the architect of the success in Syria by Assad's forces against the Western-backed terrorists that were there, that he, of course, was fighting against the Islamic State group. And it seems, Brian, that if you're fighting against the Islamic State group, then that makes you a target. It makes you a terrorist yourself if you're fighting the terrorists, and it makes you a target for potential assassination. Extrajudicial assassination, of course, no judicial process whatsoever in any of this. But he was being portrayed as the mastermind of Iran's policies right across the Middle East. And of course, this made things difficult, as we'll come on to see in a second. This made things difficult for Trump and others. But I was travelling home from Northern Ireland on Friday after this had happened, and well, the BBC was giving it quite a lot of coverage on the radio, on BBC Radio News. And this was really the sentiment that they were presenting. The coverage was, I have to say, an absolute disgrace. There was nothing balanced about it at all. They were absolutely for it. They were promoting the notion that this was an extremely well executed surgical strike. They were very happy that this man had been killed, and it wasn't journalism.
No, well, we've got a little bit more detail coming up shortly on the BBC and how they've reported this, and we'll get a little deeper into that.
Absolutely. Now, David Scott, let's welcome you to the programme now, because you wanted to highlight this particular article from the 3rd of January 2020. If we just stick with the BBC for a second, and although this isn't about Iran, it very much continues this sentiment of promotion of war.
Yes, it's a strange little article. On the surface, it seems to be the BBC anti-recruitment campaign, because here they're quoting one disgruntled squaddy, and there's always plenty of those, and he's saying, well, it's just a boring job because there aren't any wars going on. Now, this seems a very weird thing to say, because there's the people in the military who put their lives on the line when there is active war are normally the last people to advocate for it. But here's this squaddy being quoted. He said, all you do is wake up in the morning and pick up rubbish around camp. I left because the money is terrible. He says, he tells Radio 1 Newsbeat, hard-hitting stuff here. In my last year, I spent 11 months out of the country away from my family, and the accommodation was awful. And the food is the worst you'll ever get in your life. So, well, he had 11 months out of 12 abroad. So it doesn't sound like he was just sitting around camp. And why did the BBC choose to promote this? To what, lessen recruitment, or to do something else? It just seemed a very strange piece.
So within the context of, if we come back to the situation with Iran then, in the meantime, and their coverage of the assassination of Soleimani, BBC absolutely promoting the war narrative. This implies the same type of sentiment from the BBC, this particular article. What was your thoughts on the coverage of Soleimani's assassination on Friday and Saturday?
Well, it didn't really provide anything in depth. There was no huge analysis as to why this was done, what the implications were. It was all very surface, and you got either the knee-jerk Labour Party type socialist response, which is it's bad because it's Donald Trump, or this equally knee-jerk reaction, it's good because the Iranians are what we overdue with the war with Iran. I'm not quite sure what the motivation or the analysis that generates it's good comes from, because if you are in favor of this, you must have a view that there is an analysis, a calculation, which says this reduces the chance of more serious conflict later. This reduces the chance of more widespread bloodshed later. And that seemed to be missing from the analysis as far as I could see.
Well, I don't think by lunchtime on Saturday, I'm not certain it even got as far as any kind of analysis. It really was pushing the war narrative. This is great. This is fantastic that it's been done, and so on. But look, let's look at what Boris Johnson had to say. He said General Qasem Soleimani posed a threat to all our interests and was responsible for a pattern of disruptive, destabilizing behavior in the region. So, David, what's he talking about? Is it disruptive and destabilizing to be attacking ISIS? Is that what Boris is upset about?
Yes, I mean, disruptive and destabilizing. Well, I suppose it depends on your perspective. If your perspective is from Syria, then no, it's neither of these things. If your perspective is from Saudi Arabia, and our government's perspective does seem to be from Saudi Arabia, then yes, I can see there's an issue there, because this is a regional struggle between Saudi interests and Iranian interests over control, and America's the big stick that every side in these regional conflicts wants to wield, particularly the Air Force. So yeah, that says that we are taking a Saudi view of it. It doesn't suggest that we're taking a British view of it. I don't know that our interests are being particularly rationally thought through here.
Well, I think I'd have to be bullish there and say, well, is Boris Johnson putting UK interests out there? Is that what he has on his mind, or is actually he thinking about the interests of Israel? I think we must bring Israel into this. And Boris Johnson, of course, avid supporter. So we don't know what our top politicians are actually working for at the moment. Maybe we'll discuss a little bit more in a minute. The other thing I think is interesting is he's using the language that gets used for routine politics. The Tories have said that they want change agents. They're going to use disruption to break down public services. This man has used disruptive techniques apparently in the Middle East, and that's a big problem.
Well, Boris did make that little statement that we read out a second ago, but the main official statement didn't come from the UK on its own. It came from the UK, France and Germany jointly, so that is the E3. And of course the E3 has had a long-standing involvement in Iran with respect to the Iran nuclear question. So they said, we've condemned the recent attacks on coalition forces in Iraq and gravely concerned by the negative role Iran has played in the region, including through the IRGC and the Al-Quds force under the command of General Soleimani. There's now an urgent need for de-escalation. We call on all parties to exercise our utmost restraint and responsibility. The current cycle of violence in Iraq must be stopped. We specifically call on Iran to refrain from further violent action or proliferation, and urge Iran to reverse all measures inconsistent with the JCPOA. So suddenly they're saying, well, we know there's effectively been an act of war carried out against you, but you've got to de-escalate. You've got to refrain from any further any retaliatory action. But David, most importantly, you've got to refrain from any further proliferation and make sure that you get back on board all the restrictions that are placed on Iran by the JCPOA.
Yes, and that's been specifically rejected in a statement by the Iranians within the last 48 hours. So they're saying that essentially this, and you're right, it is absolutely an act of war, means that they are going to tear up the nuclear deal, but that's really code for they're going to renegotiate the nuclear deal. We're still happy to talk to the Europeans, but we're not really going to abide by anything right now. As the first part of punishing the West for this particular action, I suspect.
Yes. Okay. Well, there was a statement from the Iranian Parliament, the Iraqi Parliament over what happened. The Iraq government commits to revoke its request for assistance from the International Coalition Fighting Islamic State due to the end of military operations in Iraq and the achievement of victory. The Iraqi government must work to end the presence of any foreign troops on Iraqi soil and prohibit them from using its land, airspace or water for any reason. So Iraq now is saying that the US must leave. Well, what was Donald Trump's response to that? As we might expect, we're not leaving unless they pay us back for it. He didn't make clear what it is. We will impose sanctions like they've never seen before if the US is not able to leave Iraq on a very friendly basis. So we're not leaving unless they pay us back for it. Does that mean that, so we have bombed Iraq back to the Stone Age twice. We then, through whatever mechanism you like, we then saw the rise of ISIS in Iraq. And then we bombed Iraq again to get rid of ISIS. Is this really Trump's position? And then Iraq has to pay the United States back for being bombed 3 times. Is that what he's saying, David?
Well, here you have the complete incoherence of the entire policy. Now, when Trump was a candidate, before he had all of the political influences on him and tightrope to walk, when he became president, he was quite clear on this. They wanted out of the foreign wars. It was costing America a fortune. It wasn't making America any safer. We don't want to keep doing this. And he's been roped in eventually. I mean, I think he's resisted quite a lot of calls for aggressive military action, but he's been roped in eventually to doing this. There's been a response, which is get thee hence, great Satan, essentially. And his response to that is incoherent. And it's actually quite rare that you see Trump be completely incoherent, but I think that statement is.
Well, you've mentioned it, so let's just briefly discuss this. Why do you think that he has taken this action? Because, as you say, he campaigned on the basis of not interfering in foreign conflict. Is this related to impeachment proceedings and the fact that he needs the support of neocons in the Senate in the next few weeks? I did notice that Lindsey Graham was one of the first people to congratulate him for this decisive action that he took. Do you think that's what's behind it?
Well, I think in part it is. I saw one analysis from the States that pinned very much this as the reason why it all transpired. You have the Democrats' illogical attack on Trump, the actually quite laughable impeachment process, which is now stalled because he can't really go forward because there really isn't a charge, nothing's holding together, but it's all politicized. Now, Trump's safe because he has a majority of 17 in the Senate, but those 17, a huge proportion of the Republican group in the Senate are neocons. And they want war. They want a much more aggressive foreign policy. So is Trump actually got himself into a position where for short-term political survival, he's needed to take this action? I think that's perhaps part of it. Part of it seems to be an I'm not Hillary point, which he's wanting to make for electoral and other reasons, because Hillary did nothing over Benghazi. And he's going to be the anti-Hillary. He's going to react in a sweeping and presidential manner when American interests are threatened, and show he's the opposite of Hillary, that he's effective. So that's part of it as well. Ego is part of it as well, I think. But yes, this push towards boxing Trump into following the neocon road because he needs the neocon support, I think that's certainly high in the list of possible motivations.
Now, you've already briefly mentioned this, but here's Haaretz. Nuclear deal will no longer limit uranium enrichment. So they're suggesting that Tehran rolls back landmark deal in wake of US assassination of the top Iranian general. This can't end well.
No, it's just to read a wee bit more detail from that article. Iran said Sunday it would no longer abide by any of the limits of its unraveling 2015 nuclear deal with world powers after the US airstrike killed a top Iranian general in Baghdad, abandoning the Accord's key provision that blocks Tehran from having enough material to build an atomic weapon. Iran insisted in a state television broadcast that remained open to negotiations with European partners, who so far have been unable to offer Tehran a way to sell its crude oil abroad despite US sanctions. It also didn't back off earlier promises that it wouldn't seek a nuclear weapon. So it's not particularly aggressive as a statement, but it's certainly saying, well, we're essentially suspending all aspects of that nuclear deal.
Going back to the BBC's coverage on Friday, just briefly, they had Oz Kataji on as one of their expert analysts, explaining how Soleimani had been really responsible for genocide in Aleppo, in Deir ez-Zor and places and other places in Syria. It completely 180 degrees from reality. This seems to be Haaretz's take on it. As Soleimani's megalomania grew, he became less grounded in reality. Brian suggested that we can't ignore Israel. I think that's right. How much of what Trump has done here do you think is as a result of Israeli pressure?
Very difficult to say, but it's very clear that the Israeli position has for a long time been that we're going to have a war with Iran. That's kind of inevitable, and that the best sort of thing to do is to have America lead that. So it's been a long time Israeli policy to do whatever they can to engineer this sort of conflict. So I don't imagine that's changed. And the Haaretz article here, interesting in places because it looks at the background. It talks about the close relationship between this general and Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, and the influence that he managed to get because of that relationship. It talks about the personality cult. So the personality cult and public relations that Soleimani cultivated played a role in molding his image and led to talk of him as a potential future president if and when he hung up his uniform. Soleimani was intoxicated by the waves of admiration for him at home and abroad. Now, I'm not sure whether he was intoxicated or not, but then Haaretz goes on to say that he was losing his hold on reality. He says, they say that, and then as happens with megalomaniacs, his hold on reality unraveled. Soleimani did not understand America's quiet and sometimes unseen power. President Trump's unpredictable and conciliatory policies towards Iran just contributed to that, particularly when the president failed to respond to provocations and acts of aggression. Trump ignored the downing of an American drone, an attack on Western oil tankers in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and wide-scale cyber attacks on Saudi Arabia. Soleimani thought he could continue to act with impunity, and his excessive time in his position, 22 years, may also have contributed to his sense of invincibility. So that's the allegation from Haaretz. Not convinced that that's necessarily all that accurate, but here we see they list the number of cases where Trump didn't act. So it's very clear, even from this is a left-wing, generally speaking, pro-peace, pro-conciliatory newspaper within Israel. You see the Israeli policy is solidly anti-Iran and keen on American aggressive involvement against Iran.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I took a look at this reporting by the BBC, which is basically saying, trust us, the BBC, we're going to answer your questions about the killing. Will the killing spark war? The journalist is Jonathan Marcus. I was a bit confused actually when I initially saw this article, because there's some headers with names next to it, which I thought were the journalists who'd answered the questions, but apparently they were members of the public the BBC had selected as asking the most appropriate questions. So a little bit confusing. We did speak to the BBC about this morning to ask, where was the depth of the analysis. We didn't really get an answer. But if you go into the article, and I could encourage people to do it, you can follow through to a link which takes you to this, which is US-Iran relations, a brief history. And what it says in the first little header is that from the CIA orchestrated overthrow of Iran's prime minister in 1953 to tension and confrontation under President Trump, a look back over more than 65 years of what he describes as tricky relations between Iran and the US. So I was fascinated by this because, of course, the BBC hasn't done any substance in looking at what was actually going on with that US and British intelligence overthrow of a democratically elected government. But they did, neither did they actually mention the Iran-Iraq war at all, which is 8 years worth of particularly vicious war when the US, UK, France and others were pumping weapons into both sides, which was a very profitable market. But the BBC didn't want to go near that. There was an embedded video clip. Again, encourage people to have a listen or watch this. It starts out by saying this: the trouble started between the two countries in 1953 when Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was ousted in a coup orchestrated by US and British intelligence agency. So that was just given to you, Mike, as totally factual. It's the sort of thing that British and Americans do, and really you shouldn't worry about it. It's quite normal. Now let's move on to the real bad guys. So BBC up to its best. But of course, one of the things that this article did mention was the Iran-Contra Affair, where it gives a casual mention, but there's no proper analysis into this affair either. And this one caught my attention because over the Christmas period, I've been watching two really excellent documentaries, which were principally focused on the cover-up of the murder of two young teenagers in Arkansas. And this led through to drugs, the Iran-Contra Affair. And I really do encourage our viewers to go and have a look at the two documentaries. This is the first one. This is part one. Thank you for that, Mike. And it's labelled there, The Railroad Murders, but I'm going to pick up on this man speaking out. And there is a second part which is more focused on the cover-up of the murder of the two boys. But let's have a listen to what Terry Reid, ex-CIA operative, says in this documentary.
Let me tell you a little about myself. I'm a family man, businessman, and Vietnam veteran whose life got a little off course as the result of the so-called Iran-Contra Affair. But just to set the record straight, I'm not a drug trafficker, and I've never knowingly associated with anyone who is. I was, however, recruited and freely enlisted in the so-called enterprise for the purpose of assisting the Contras. I did so purely for patriotic reasons, although others I worked with obviously had selfish agendas. Be that as it may, I have no regrets in helping to rid Nicaragua of the communist-backed Sandinista regime. I would do it all again. I'm participating in the production of this documentary to show you that the real Nicaraguan guerrilla support effort took place in Arkansas through a very sophisticated CIA network set in place by the Reagan White House and monitored by Bill Clinton's gubernatorial administration. I know this because I was part of that support effort. In fact, After viewing this documentary, I'm confident you will conclude that through the efforts of Ronald Reagan's Attorney General Edwin Meese, phase one of the deceit began. Let me explain. By Meese divulging the unauthorized weapons shipments to our enemy Iran and accusing a lowly Marine Lieutenant Colonel of seizing the reins of foreign policy, well, that act in itself was a clever diversion. The media went for the bait and immediately labeled the entire fiasco the Iran-Contra Affair. But instead of scurrying east out of Washington and focusing their investigative efforts on the Middle East, the hostage crisis, and the diversion of weapons sales profits to the Contras, reporters should have gone west to Arkansas.
I found this a very, very powerful clip within the video. Let's think about what we're watching at the moment, yet more trouble with Iran. Here's the admission that weapons were being supplied to Iran despite a US ban on those weapons. But what this CIA man is really pointing out is, whilst the public in America and greater parts of the world via the global media were distracted back onto the issue of Iran, what the real danger was the fact that the US intelligence agencies were out of control in running drugs. And as part of one particular operation, 2 young teenage boys were murdered, and there followed an amazing cover-up which led straight back to the highest levels of power in America. So whilst we look at the current picture with Iran and what the Americans are claiming about what the Iranians have been up to, of course the BBC is not going to do any investigation to the depth that is shown in these 2 video documentaries about what has really gone on in the background to help inflame this type of trouble in the Middle East, South America and elsewhere. David, I believe that you haven't seen that particular documentary, but to me it was quite astonishing that I just happened to be watching that over the Christmas period, and the next minute we get the news about the American action. Who should we be fearful of? Should it be the Iranians? And I never thought that I would be saying this live in 2020. Should we be fearing the Iranians, or should we really fear the American government of occupation, the deep state?
Well, yes, the deep state, that's the thing. I haven't seen those videos, at least not recently. But I am familiar with the issues, having followed the work of Michael C. Rupert and Cathy O'Brien. The Mena Airport was one centre, and the Clintons were running Arkansas as a narco republic at this point. But there were many Menas all across America, and the scale of this, it was truly breathtaking. For information, the Bible on this particular subject is a book called The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade, and that's by Alfred W. McCoy. A very, very good and detailed book. It names names, dates, places. It's all the information in there, and what you see is wherever this particular set of individuals and organizations go, Southeast Asia to Afghanistan, etc., the problems the drug trade go with them, and the people who suffer are very often Americans on the streets of America.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's end this section on a somewhat positive note. It's been very interesting to see how social media has reacted, and several people sent this to me, which I found fascinating because it's a very cynical and accurate view. So we've got a picture of Iran surrounded by US bases, and the headline is that Iran, well, the Iranians have been very naughty people because they've positioned their own country provocatively. And I think this humour, very dark humour, but this shows that people are really seeing through the dross and the propaganda that's being pushed out about what's happening around Iran. And of course, the BBC at the forefront of that propaganda.
Yes. Well, I suppose let's move on then. I suppose now that we're back from our Christmas break and government back from its Christmas break, we're going to start seeing some big movement to implement the things in the Queen's speech, Brexit, online harms, and so on. But of course, the silence continues generally speaking, over the issue of what type of defence relationship we're going to have with the EU in the future. Now, I've got to say thank you to one of our viewers for sending us the latest response on this issue of Defence Union and Britain's future relationship on defence. And this comes from Conservative MP for Mid Derbyshire, Pauline Latham. So let's bring up what she said first. In her response, she said the government has always been crystal clear that defence is a national and not an EU responsibility. We've seen that in the previous template letters that have come out of Earl Howe and others. In no circumstances could Brussels direct deployment of UK forces without specific agreement of the UK government. And what's really being expressed there is the notion of an opt-in. She goes on to say there are no proposals for an EU army on the table, and several member states, including the UK, have made it clear we would not support one. That statement, as we've said many times on this programme, is absolutely true. And if you want to get more detail on that, there's an article on the UK Column website. Just search for UK Army, because really we were making the point that we should not be using the term EU Army when we talk about Defence Union and our potential involvement in it. Anyway, she goes on to say the UK welcomes the permanent structured cooperation. I think that's a bit of a move in position from previous statements, as a tool to strengthen EU member states' cooperation in military matters, provided it remains complementary to NATO. PESCO is voluntary and works on an opt-in basis, so there's the opt-in once again. A unique third country partnership with PESCO would enable practical cooperation in tackling common threats, building on our shared values and interests. And this is quite a diversion from previous statements that we've seen from MPs and ministers in the recent past, because we're now seeing from the UK side talk of a unique third country partnership. We've seen this being discussed on the EU side, but so far not on the UK side. So this is a movement in Europe's direction very much. She goes on to say this: the government has stated the UK's unequivocal commitment to European defence and security, which will continue after we leave the EU. The government has sent a strong message to allies and partners that the result of the referendum on EU membership will have no impact on any of the UK's NATO commitments, and NATO remains the cornerstone of our defence policy. So they've said that before, that NATO remains the cornerstone of our defence policy. It doesn't say, though, that NATO remains the cornerstone of Britain's defence policy, and I would just remind everybody, of course, that NATO remains the cornerstone of EU defence policy. So when she says "our," I'm not entirely clear which "our" she is talking about. But the statement that the UK's unequivocal commitment to European defence and security will continue after we leave the EU is a very important one. And this is, of course, one of the key questions. If the UK opts in, then to what degree do we opt in? This has not been discussed on a national level because there's a three-line whip on this subject. It needs to be discussed. And then she ends off by saying this: the European Intervention Initiative, EI2, is a flexible, non-binding forum that provides a framework for increased cooperation between participating NATO and non-NATO European states. It is designed to improve information sharing and planning to ensure that work is not duplicated when addressing common threats. I should stress that EI2 does not affect the independence of the UK Armed Forces in any way, as it's not a standing force. So David, I'd like to get your thoughts on what she has said here, and maybe we could begin with this statement on EI2, because there is a particularly good article written by yourself on the subject of the European Intervention Initiative. If anybody wants to go and look at it, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the whole thing, she doesn't seem to be particularly well briefed. I mean, this is fine as a set of imagined situations that maybe suit the political answer she's expected to give, but it doesn't have any relationship to reality. Right? While you were talking there, I pulled up the EU data sheet on PESCO. Right, this is a 2-page PESCO for beginners. Right, and it says PESCO is a treaty-based framework and process to deepen defence cooperation amongst EU member states who are capable and willing to do so. The aim is to jointly develop defence capabilities and make them available for EU military operations. That's quite plain. And she's just said we're going to join it voluntarily. And it doesn't affect the independence of our defence. This is just plain nonsense. If she can read, she should know this. And as for EI2, I do encourage people to seek out the article in EI2. It blew me away when I discovered all about it, because we've been looking at this for some time, and I didn't know up until shortly before writing the article that all of this exists. It's a complete duplicate for EU military union, only this time it's not done through treaty. It's done through a heads of agreement, a letter of intent, a couple of people from the House of, well, one person from the House of Lords, Lord Howe, signed us up, and we're all good to go. And how far it goes and what it does, well, it's all negotiable. And Parliament didn't have anything to say about it, or the British public, who weren't informed.
Well, indeed. So if you were to give her marks out of 10 for honesty in her answer, where would you put her?
Well, it's 1, and only then because she's mentioned third party and third country status. So that's an admission that there's something going on there, and we should be looking at that. But it's a very deceptive explanation, because it denies the nature of what PESCO is all about.
Absolutely. Okay. Any thoughts?
Well, we could say it's a lie on the public at the most. It's a mission, isn't it? You're not telling the full truth. Maybe she doesn't know what the truth is herself. So, but yeah, we don't seem to be getting much clarity out of the government at this stage.
Well, I would like to know where she got the text for that, because I'm quite sure she didn't write it. Yes. Is that from the whips? We need to find out, I think. Now, if you like what the UK column's doing, it's a new year, and you'd like to support us in doing it, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community. Your help much appreciated and much needed. Do join us there and join the community.
And can we also say thank you again? Thank you very much. All the Christmas cards, more came in while we were actually away ourselves, so we've only been able to see those today, but a lot of cards from people, and all the compliments and thanks, very welcome. Thank you.
Indeed. Now, David, we're running out of time, so briefly, if we could, you have a new opinion piece on the UK Column website called "Who Are You Calling a Monkey?" This is a follow-up to your previous piece, which, if I remember rightly, was "Who Are You Calling a Fascist?"
Yes, this one looks at the monkey chants and the associated response, including from Serie A, who provided the graphic you saw there of 3 monkeys painted in different colours, as an anti-racism campaign. And it looks at where the origin of this comes from, the belief system underpinning it, and argues that we should attack the belief system and the world view, and find a different way of seeing our fellow man, and not just try to silence people when they are actually expressing the official and mainstream worldview, but are just doing it in ways that the middle class latte sippers might not approve of. So I would ask people to have a look at that, and I hope for some lively discussion on some of the forums thereafter.
Absolutely. Now let's quickly move on to the BBC once again. Perth City Centre, it's okay to be white, stickers condemned. We're moving up to Scotland, of course. This is Perth in Scotland that we're talking about. Who is behind, or what are these okay to be white stickers all about?
Well, this is the thing. I couldn't let this one pass. This cropped up just before Christmas. So it's okay to be white stickers popped up in Perth on lampposts, as you see, and were immediately condemned by none other than John Swinney, right? And John Swinney said this is atrocious, and there's no place in Perth or any other part of the country. We must stand together and resist this unacceptable material. So there you have John Swinney telling us all it's not okay to be white, which is just remarkable. And it goes on. The Courier reported this, and the police are involved, bizarrely, right? So someone put up this "okay to be white" sticker on a lamppost. Police officers removed the sticker on George Street upon request, and officers confirmed they are investigating the spate of what is being interpreted by some as hate speech. So the Courier thinks that saying it's okay to be white might be hate speech. Okay. A spokesperson said, although no complaint has been made to police regarding these posters, they have been brought to our attention and officers are currently looking into the matter. So Police Scotland are looking in to see if it's okay to be white. We're anxious to find out what they decide, and if I get an answer, I'll be sure to tell you. Now, the Courier then went to a local campaign group. So the culprits behind the messages who have not identified themselves have been blasted by local campaign group Perth Against Racism. Now, I'm surprised that even exists, but there we go, it does. The group have already been contacted by people of colour who live in Perth, who say the stickers have made them feel sickened and disgusted and unsafe by the terrifying attitudes expressed in a time of heightened racial tension. Now, that's all of that strange. The sickened and disgusted bit is very strange because that's a totalitarian mindset. Disgust is what Hitler felt about the Jews. I don't like that kind of view. People have been made to feel unsafe by the terrifying attitudes, and it's okay to be white. This is a meme that was created in Fortran and places like this to show how ridiculous the left concentration on race had become, to trigger people into reacting strangely. And here you see it did just that. Perth Against Racism continued. A spokesman for the group said, we would like whoever was behind this to come forward and explain what their motivation is, if not white pride. This is worrying. We find it disturbing and we've contacted the police. They've been very clever not to use any racial slurs, but the connotation is there. So the people who are against racism are interpreting racism where it's not in the text. This is what this meme was meant to generate, this bizarre and illogical response, and it did just that, including in the MSP John Swinney, who no doubt felt that he had to condemn it, otherwise he would be a target and he might lose his job. So yes, a very strange set of occurrences, but whoever made that meme many miles away, probably in America, to show up how bizarre the left has become over the concept of race, they certainly scored a win there.
Okay, let's move on then. This is from The Times. Boris Johnson urged to tackle drugs death crisis. Now, of course, we've heard a lot in the mainstream media. It took them a lot to catch on to the situation in the United States over drugs deaths. Scotland has been identified, I think it was in the second half of last year, as being the worst part of the UK for this as well. And these are mainly opiate drugs, aren't they, David?
Yes, worse than Europe, I think we are now. I think it's better than just worse than the UK. It's growing and growing. Now, a couple of things I'd highlight here. One, the basic problem, which is huge. And secondly, we have here a Conservative MSP appealing to Boris Johnson to do something. Now, this is something we're seeing more and more as the nationalist government just reaches a point of stasis. It's unable to do anything. Everything is secondary to the constitutional question, which is pushed interminably, and nothing else is actually done. There is actually an absence, despite all the money being spent, an absence of governance in Scotland. And you see people now increasingly appealing to Boris Johnson to come to Scotland and to push forward issues that matter to them because they have no route through Holyrood, through the SNP administration, to get these things addressed. And also because Boris Johnson is bringing an optimism and a can-do attitude, which contrasts with the negativism and carping and whining and moaning that we're seeing from Nicola Sturgeon and her team. Now, this is relatively new because when Alex Salmond first came to power, there was a certain amount of optimism and can-do spirit about the SNP. What they chose to do was unfortunately very harmful, but at least there was some action and there wasn't this huge negativity and inaction and exhaustion that we're now seeing in the SNP administration. So I think this is something we're going to see more of, appeals to the Boris Johnson government to do some governing in Scotland because Holyrood's failing.
Just to finish off, what what prospect does Holyrood have of reinvigorating itself while there's no real opposition or competition to what the SNP is doing?
No, it has none, really. It needs a change. At this point, it needs a change of government. It needs a complete change. And that's not looking like it's particularly close, partly because of the collapse of the Labour Party, which is ongoing and doesn't look like reversing. So it's going to be more of the same, unfortunately, in Scotland for some time. But the level of support for the SNP, or rather the level of opposition, strong opposition to the SNP, seems to be mounting. So there may be some change come the next election, which is now 2021-2. They changed it to avoid a UK election, which then didn't happen. We're sitting without any real movement in Holyrood. There's very little happens there that's of interest. There's very little other than just constant complaints about failures in public services, and then constant talk about the constitutional crisis and question being the answer to everything, and no real dynamism to sort out any real problems in the country at all.
Yeah.
Okay. We're right up for time. I wonder whether I can just end on this one, which just links into your recruitment for the army. If you want to know what the BBC thinks that young people should be doing, well, this is Newsbeat. I dropped out of school. Now I sell £60,000 trainers. That's £60,000 for a pair of unique trainers.
Excellent.
And BBC not so keen on this, from the Daily Mail pointing out that actually Saturday jobs now are dying because the youngsters don't want to actually work. So, David, there we are. BBC attacking army recruiting. At the same time, they're going to solve the problem of jobs for young people because we're all going to sell trainers. I think it's a good system. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.